Hi, thanks for tuning in to our Practical Nerds weekly podcast. I'm Shub, and together with my partner and co host Patrick, we normally invest in founders in design, construction, renovation, and logistics technology. Many of our friends in the ecosystem wanted us to start a podcast on the built world, and in return, we decided to honor their request with a show about nothing at all. Hey Patrick, back with nothing. How have you been?
Pretty nothing.
Pretty nothing?
Yeah, pretty nothing. Is that an adjective?
Nice.
No. But I can't believe we have March already. So that's one.
Yeah.
Time passes. Um, but you must be feeling time passes even more because you have been traveling lately a lot to the US, Mexico, now India coming up. Isn't
Yes,
that right?
exactly. It certainly feels that way.
Yeah.
Um, Interesting times.
Interesting
You
times.
know, on I guess that's as good a segue as any. It feels like just a few short months ago, to the best of my memory, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, we were talking about how the US as a market is an opportunity, not just for founders based in the US, but for several other founders who may have the right capabilities to target certain niches. So we spoke
Hmm.
about how founders from Europe, Australia, Israel, India, etc., have historically targeted the US with great success. And we spoke about how the characteristics of such businesses, such founders, etc. So we thought what would be a pretty cool mix up, also perhaps quite topical given the world we find ourselves in now and all the rhetoric and the narrative, etc., going around, of doing an inverse scenario. In other words, what if you're a founder in the US looking to target markets outside of the US,
Mm,
right? So you're building for the world. It may include you may also be targeting the US customers, but non-US customers are a big part of your strategy or your GTM and what your product represents.
yes. Let's do that. I like it. And I think there's a cultural component. There is sort of a um, maybe business rules or business norms, let's call them
Hmm.
business norms
Yes.
component to it. And then maybe to some degree in some countries more and some others less, maybe there's even a certification slash
Hmm.
legal accreditation type of
Yes.
component. So let's maybe go through these. Shub, let's start with Asia. Asia is historically, depending on what, China obviously, but also Japan historically, very
Hmm.
strong trade partner of the US. India is a
Yes.
rising powerhouse, already a powerhouse and still rising.
Hmm.
So the trade relations, but also the market opportunity between the states and these countries can be very interesting for construction tech founders. Now, to go into India with a software, that's its own animal. So maybe
Yeah.
let's bracket this out.
Hmm.
Going into China, going into East Asia with Japan or Korea,
Hmm.
even that is a different culture with different norms than the
Yeah.
Indian subcontinent. So walk us through. I'm an American construction tech founder. I perhaps want to build business partnerships. Perhaps I
Hmm.
even want to enter these countries. How do I have to think about it in terms of culture, business norms, and maybe even legal frameworks?
Yeah. I think first thing to call out, these markets are probably not the obvious market that US founders may consider as the obvious next geographic expansion or even the first stop, right? I
Yeah.
think historically, what we have seen and which also screams out as the obvious choice is, the Anglosphere as the next big place to expand. So, you're thinking UK, Canada, Australia, etc. Those are the obvious markets. Now, there are some reasons, and anecdotally, Patrick, both you and I, we've heard more and more Western and in particular US founders and companies thinking about an Asia strategy or an India strategy or going Eastern. Uh, Again, I think right pointing out some of the big differences. Uh, None of these are Anglo countries to begin with, and I think that it cannot be stated enough because, and that translates into many different things. It translates into the ease and fluidness with which the representatives of the market, the actual users of these products, will run with your software. You'll need a ton of localization. A lot of these countries also tend to uh, have, excuse me, evolving structures in how, for example, taxation, etc., is implemented. So one, I guess, complaint or pet peeve, a lot of global or multinational companies often have against India. I think the frequency is reduced, but in general, they nevertheless have is, hey, every few years, it feels like the taxation framework has changed, the regulation framework has changed, and they're required to constantly update, their services or the framework with which the product or service is offered, right? This is particularly, more apparent in consumer-facing companies, where, again, stating the obvious, U.S. companies enjoy a very healthy advantage and track record of obviously entering new markets all over the world and successfully penetrating them. But I think more so than people perceive, in Western markets, I think there is a certain comfort or familiarity with how legal regulation processes evolve and how they are sort of
Yeah.
percolated, and also the speed at which it happens. So sometimes what I find is the change can feel a bit abrupt and also much quicker than a lot of Western companies imagine. Mind you, the whole of Asia is obviously not homogeneous, but it is definitely true in India, for example, some of the Southeast Asian economies. The regulation is implemented much faster, and the companies therefore need to take it into account on a more tactical basis.
The US economy allows business participants to be fairly transactional with each other because the business culture has evolved that way. And by the way, I mean this completely neutral. I'm not attaching an opinion to the word transactional here. It has benefits, it has downsides. Transactional in this context means that it's easy to do transactions and it's quick to do transactions with each other. So in that sense, is what I'm saying is it's a economy that has allowed you to be very transactional with each other. With that comes certain behavior, relatively quick, relatively curt communication when things appear very clear, when perhaps there's a certain standard to the transaction, etc. If I'm used to the transactional way of doing business and I try to acquire a business partner, could be a customer, could be a supplier, could be a joint venture, it could be a channel partnership, all sorts of business relations that I could have in the Asian countries. And now I'm acting in my usual transactional normed way. What is going to happen in Asia?
I think firstly, the Asian markets are not used to a very fluid, completely frictionless, direct to transaction sort of mindset. Perhaps it may have something to do with our upbringing, our values. It may also have something to do with, I guess, recent history where it isn't often believed to be in everyone's interest to just rush forward to closing of a transaction, where I think the perception is, hey, you may be overlooking facts, etc. So the cultural connotation was often, hey, make sure you've turned over every stone, etc. Figured out who you're dealing with. I think trust is also, as in person to person trust, is um, believed to be a more important aspect, unless, and I'll come back to this caveat in a bit, and you need to build that trust. So, and we've spoken about trust deficit on practical notes before. I cannot overstate that this actually becomes, it sort of levels up to a material degree in Asian markets, where it's almost as if you can forget about everything else, just focus on bridging the trust deficit. Because if you try to rush through it, at some point the trust deficit will come in and that will put a halt to your progress entirely, right? And I think actually, if you go further into East Asian cultures, it ramps up to a severe degree where even if you think you're making progress at, let's say, mid or lower levels of the hierarchy of an organization, if there is a trust deficit at the higher levels of the organization or the ultimate decision maker, things can completely come to a standstill in a way where the Western counterpart may not even have a clue as to what's going on or why things have come to a standstill.
So what would be the cues then that how would I notice?
Silence, lack of responses, right? Lack of any sort of intent or decisiveness. You sort of like either the communication, the cadence of communication has slowed down, or you're not getting direct responses, or you're sort of circling the same loop, which could be a way for those parties to buy time. It could be a way for them to get additional information, or it could be a way to just avoid the shame or avoid the unpleasantness of communicating a bad decision or a negative decision.
Yeah. I'm not an expert in those regions. I have my experience, but it doesn't allow me to be an expert. It's just experiences. And so when I made my experiences in China, for example, I learned the framing the following way. The Western upbringing and Western business norms typically frame you to attach everything that happens to the specific instance or the specific individual. The product isn't good enough. Oh, the
Mm-hmm.
timing currently doesn't work out. It's not a fit
Mm-hmm.
for your business, or whatever. I said something wrong. Whereas especially the East Asian cultures, maybe it's similar also for South Asia, Shub, typically attach the upbringing is that you attach most of the behaviors to the context. And
Yes.
so that's part of the trust piece here. Is so if you're now perhaps a founder that is building out of the US and you're seeking a business partnership or relationship in Asia, everything comes to a standstill. There is silence. Your brain would be conditioned to, okay, probably my product is not fitting. So I open an email and
Mm.
say, hey, just following up here.
Yeah.
If it's currently not a good timing, let me know. I'll circle back next year. Zero added trust to the relationship, because I'm not, when I'm doing that, I'm not attaching it to the context. I'm attaching
Yeah.
it to whatever facts I presented, etc. What
Mm-hmm.
would be the more appropriate email to write at that stage?
The more appropriate email may be, hey, can we get on a call? I'd just like to hear from you. By the way, sometimes just that alone may be sufficient, right? Because in many of these situations, one person to one person call, you may get more information on what is actually holding back your client or prospective stakeholder, then like a formal email asking for an update on the product and so on. Because on a call, they may specifically point out what is the bottleneck with whatever, maybe a trust deficit, maybe something else, or maybe softly let you down.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
Actually, so I teased like there's a caveat in which you
Yes.
can sort of get around this whole thing. It specifically applies to, I would say, many emerging markets around the world in particular, and I think you uh, provided a brief primer on that, where, in many of these markets, software spending isn't big.
Yeah.
Actually, now that I think about it, I think it applies to more than just emerging markets. So I'll just carry on with my point. So when software spend by itself is not a big driver, or it's too early in the market for software spend to be critical, the market obviously goes more towards transactions and outcomes, as you pointed out. So if what you're providing is a service that is so frictionless and directly aligned with the transactions the market is seeking, or where it has pent up demand, that can help you circumvent the discussion on trust deficit, because the fact that you're delivering or enabling the transaction serves as the proxy for solving for trust.
But that would have to be an established product that gets bought in the market. There is an established buying governance and
Mm-hmm.
buying process for it. There are budgets for it. There's decision making for that.
Yes.
But once I change one of these parameters, would that still be true?
Now, what I can imagine, it is not an exact proxy for this. If I, let's say, uh, so by the way, all of the things you said are true. I can, for example, if I ask myself the question, hey, but let's say I'm a firm based in the US selling software, is there no hope for me in these markets? I think I wouldn't go that far. I think what uh, perhaps maybe a more appealing way of going about it is like a DIY sales approach, or actually not even an insider sales, a DIY sales approach where you just push the product through online channels, through the App Store, Play Store, etc. Let it organically flow, and let professional users sort of organically discover and have the ability to onboard and use it, right? Uh, For example, and I think this is again counterintuitive, while the per user revenue is very low in markets like India, in terms of the aggregate revenue, there's still very significant countries, significant markets for many of the large tech companies around the world, simply because the user base is so much larger,
Right.
right? So I think you have to quite often change the frame of how you're thinking from how much you can extract from each user to how much you can extract from the market. And I think the two lead you to very different conclusions on how you price the product and therefore what you offer in return for that
Okay,
price.
got it. Before we move to one or two other regions, Shub, from how we grow up in the West, how we do business, perhaps especially in the US,
Mm-hmm.
what is like the easiest mistake to do when trying to do business in construction, India or East Asia?
Mm. So look, I'm not. Um, I'm working on it, but by no means am I a US expert. What I will say, which is in some contexts very refreshingly different, in some contexts it is also feels different, perhaps not in so good a way. Most American, especially American founders, professionals, are very competent at selling, right? They
Hmm.
know how to sell everything. The culture and the business machinery is very, very well aligned to it, right? In many other cultures, and I'd be curious to get your take on that from a European standpoint, Patrick, most cultures, sometimes they may be very impressed with the selling capability and that may work, but many a time it may be quite jarring. It may induce a sort of uh, like a metaphorical gag reflex type reaction where you're like, hey, hold on, I don't need to be sold that hard, right? Maybe let's take it a bit slow and let's try to understand a little bit more instead of so much hyperbole, so much selling effort going on, right? Again, there's pluses and minuses. I think most American founders and salespeople are so strong at what they do. It perhaps need a little bit of tempering to be more aligned with the market reality.
Okay, got it. Yeah, to answer the same question, and we're casually moving to Europe, if you are building a contact in the US and you are thinking about the European market, so with regard to the, let's say, selling process and presentation, Europe is not one country, it's not one culture, but it does have certain baselines that are pretty prevalent across the continent. What I mean by that is, for example, in Southern Europe, the relationship is more important than in Northern Europe. Northern Europe can be more cold, rational. Southern Europe can be a bit more, let's say, family style and handshake kind of style, but not to the degree Asia would. And the baseline when you're coming with this kind of approach into Europe is Europeans, many Europeans will typically gravitate towards substance. They will typically gravitate towards trying to understand the nature of something, of your product, could be your construction software. Where does it come from? What is the market context? Explain this to me, explain how it makes sense in that context. And that can generally slow down the velocity with which you can sell in Europe. If you don't have these answers ready, maybe they are not obvious, maybe they are hard to explain, maybe you are very early stage and you don't have the answers just yet. So
Mm-hmm.
then if you now if you do the American style that you just pointed out, you look like overcompensating to
Mm.
many Europeans. And the Europeans will actually oftentimes have a reaction to it of, hey, maybe this is just a brochure. Maybe this is just some superficial story, but there's nothing behind it, which doesn't even have to be true. The Europeans are very quick to judge, oftentimes, and not always rightly so.
Mm.
And they might be very wrong in their judgment, but that is the reaction that you would get. So, in a European context, oftentimes, if you open the conversation with a lot of facts, observations, and you leave judgment outside of it, they will follow suit. They will then also leave the judgment outside of the
Mm.
door. Whereas if you come with a very emotional or narrative driven pitch, they will revert to a judgmental type of reaction. Now, again, Southern Europe, this will be a little bit different. Northern Europe, more cold. Um, uh, you will meet very strong reactions
Hmm.
to that degree, right? So yeah, that's one of the things. And quite honestly, many Europeans are not trained in sales. For that
Hmm.
reason, they're actually not very good at sales because if you think in job roles, the one of the baseline DNAs of the European culture is think of them as engineers.
Hmm.
So that's in a business culture, that's something that you will see across the continent. So if you're now selling software, point
Mm-hmm.
out facts, point out observations, try to be extremely to the point, as much to the point as you can be, leave room for questions. That is oftentimes a much better way of doing it rather than speaking for 15 minutes and being in a very salesy mode.
That is actually very insightful. And do you think, given the European preference for facts and observations rather than judgments, does that usually help towards a purposeful, faster closure towards a successful deal, or not necessarily? Uh,
It will depend. It will depend strongly on the context. So
hmm.
if your business, so oftentimes from the outside, when you're not from Europe and perhaps you've done bit of business with Europe but not as much, you can easily get the impression that things move slowly in the EU, Europe, that it's not as innovative, etc. I
Hmm.
don't share that view at all, and I have lived on 3 different continents for a while, so I have a little bit of a polyglot exposure, but not not like many years and decades. And now I came back to Europe. In my heart, I'm still European, and that's where most of my experience is. But I have a little bit of that experience. So the Europeans will be extremely decisive when things make extreme sense in their
Hmm.
specific context. And usually, in many European cultures, once a decision is taken, it will be forcefully implemented.
Okay.
What the metaphor to think of is it's very difficult to get the train on the rail, but
Hmm.
once it's on the rail, it will run through walls. When Europeans have taken substantiated decisions, oftentimes they will run. And also, by the way, it's very difficult to stop that train for exactly
I
that
see.
reason, because that's a new decision for them that has to make sense. That's
Okay.
not good. It's not making you very flexible or agile. But once you have a decision, it gets implemented oftentimes. Now, to get the decision, it needs to make sense in the context. Europeans are, because they are so, let's say, engineering minded, so, let's say, fact. Not everything is a fact, but I'm using it as sort of to describe that they are looking for facts. They are looking for
Yes.
something objective, even when they cannot get it.
Hmm.
Um, that means that taking innovative decisions and that is not always easy. And it's also one of the reasons, by the way, why Europeans oftentimes try to minimize the downside and not maximize the upside. So if
I
you're
see.
coming with a pitch that tells them what is a huge opportunity,
Hmm.
it's oftentimes they will get it, but oftentimes you need to cover that as well with, hey, how do I protect your risk? And it's sometimes even the most easy sell if you actually take away risk for a
Hmm.
European and then you add the upside on top. Now, if that risk is a very acute problem to them today, or bureaucracy, compliance, etc., is a very acute problem for them today, then all of a sudden the sale can actually be very quick in
Mm.
Europe. Yeah. But that's how you have to figure out how is it fitting in that context of Europe.
Gotcha. And you mentioned earlier that all of Europe is not the same, which obviously is a true statement. Now, there's obviously two counter views, I guess two opposite sides to an argument that could be made. One view is, yes, it's not the same, but it's by and large, it's EU, right? They're all sort of in proximity to each other. They're all sort of have closeness in terms of cultural ties, behaviors, etc. So
It's true.
if you get it into one market, you can get the whole of EU. As in, that's a hypothesis or an assertion, right? The counter view is, hey, you also need language localizations, you need cultural localizations. Each sub-region within Europe has an affinity for certain kinds of things, which may not be the same as the other. Where do you stand on this?
I stand on the former, not the latter. I actually think the EU is a very homogeneous and uniform market. However, that does require certain smart recruiting and hiring and setup choices for each of the major markets. So in the US, I will be reasonably successful selling a construction tech product from California into Alabama. Now, I can already tell you, but my parents had a construction business in Florida, that language, dialect, people will spot where you're coming from. And hey, I mean, if you're also from the same region, sure. I mean, the business transaction becomes that little bit easier. That's just human. But by and large, I will have the ability to sell across the continent if I navigate those quirks. Now, in Europe days, like you say, I need to localize the language. And because the cultures are also a little bit more pronounced locally, but they are very similar on a DNA level, I will benefit from hiring a local team that actually has the local barn smell, that has the ability to speak locally. When I do that, actually, I will be able to sell very similar products across the continent as long as I localize the distribution a little bit. Yeah. And so that is something that I think too few founders actually appreciate, is they are trying to copy product and channel and team across the continent. And they are wondering, why does it not work? Oh, US is so much easier. No, you're just lazy. You should just take the same product, the same channels, but localize the teams. And that's not, that it's actually not more expensive. It's you need to ramp up your team anyway. But that's how you get there. So
I
in my
see.
opinion, that's entirely possible. I just wanted to make one other comment, right? So the American mind will oftentimes be trained to pitching the upside of things and great opportunities and grand visions. And it's true that I think that's one of the great qualities of why you can have a very positive, optimistic, and innovative business culture. And it's my experience also that it's true that the Europeans come from a different basic stance. It doesn't mean they cannot be innovative. It doesn't mean they cannot be visionary. Great companies have been born here also recently,
Yes.
but it's not the basic stance. So that means that if I'm now giving a bombastic pitch about how to change the world, I can already tell you that 9 out of 10 construction companies will not take the call with you much further, right?
Yeah.
So think about, again, how to actually meet them in their business reality, and that is take away risk. And when you do that for me, then we can have the other conversation.
Yeah. You know what? Before we wrap up, there's some similarities in the observations we made about Europe and Asia, and especially how they may negatively react to some features that we see in American founders, salespeople, business people, etc. But there's one geography I want to call out, which actually neither belongs to the Anglosphere nor belongs, or we haven't talked about yet. Although technically it belongs in Asia, but for whatever reason is not discussed in the same way, is the Middle East.
Yeah.
Or to be more specific countries within the GCC, which I think are very interesting markets to target for American founders. And I'm specifically pointing out Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, right? And Patrick, we've discussed this over the last year or so when we've looked at a few opportunities in these regions. There is I mean, on the surface, it's not really peculiar if you think about it, but nevertheless, it stands out as a contrast to the other regions. There is a peculiar liking in these regions and in the large companies in these regions for American products and technology, right? So in that sense, it is quite distinctive from the other regions. There's several other reasons to it, which we'll probably not go into in this episode, but these are markets where you have some clients with as high a willingness to pay as it gets, very large projects, or the projects also are as large as they get, and with a distinctive liking for American companies, right? Keep in mind what you need to be positioned as is you need to be one of the best, or at least one of the better American service providers or technology providers out there, and then you'll actually be in with a fair shot. So that's a region I found where if you're not an American company, oddly enough, or maybe it's not so odd, you start off with a disadvantage. So if you're an American founder, I think it's not a bad market to consider for one of your first geographic expansions.
What to avoid if I go after that market? What is an easy mistake to do?
So what I've observed is, the American, what we refer to as a bombastic style of selling, it definitely works in that region, but it's also a region where in-person meetings, going through the right person who then, refers you to go on to the next person who's the decision maker, that works. It's not, so if you're looking for, hey, point out to me the corporate hierarchy and I will work the organization in this form, it probably doesn't quite fit those norms as you may see in other economies. It is more the way you navigate these organizations is the specific gatekeepers at each stage, and it doesn't always correlate with what you see as the
Hmm.
corporate hierarchy. And those gatekeepers kind of control either the relationship or control the decision making or control who even gets to meet the next person.
Could be an advisor to the family that doesn't show up in the org chart.
Correct. Exactly. That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Hmm.
And many a time they will, if, for example, your first meeting is happening over a video conference, it'll almost be regarded as them having not met you at all. So I've also
Hmm.
heard that from founders and
Oh,
business people in
interesting.
that region. It mentally registers as the first meeting when you've showed up in the region and met them.
Okay,
Yeah,
got it.
so that's one of those peculiarities. But many other things, interestingly, work in an American founder's favor in that region.
Brilliant. So not only can we think of the cross-border element in construction tech between the continents as selling into the US, we can also think of it as, hey, because Shub, I think we kind of glossed over it at the beginning, but construction tech is maturing. So
Hmm.
since we're doing this, we're now in year 7. It's extremely positive how construction tech has developed in terms of funding, number of foundings,
Yes.
quality of talent and founders, adoption by customers, and it's that virtuous flywheel. And so, because of that, we're also at some point going to enter a stage, hopefully, at which more and more construction techs internationalize more and more. I mean, we're still
Yes.
living in a world where Procore hasn't truly tapped into large percentages of its revenue outside of the US, but that's not
Yeah.
for the lack of trying. They are
Hmm.
investing in that. They are going to have to figure that out. And as far as I know, they want to.
Yes.
So we might be entering that stage. And so it's very interesting then for every founder around the globe to be aware of how to actually internationalize when the time is right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for the good chat.
Likewise, sir. Look forward to the next one.
Cool. Safe travels.
Bye bye.